Let all who read me beware of the grey dwarfs, the skulkers in the darkness, the soulless ones. They are born from rot and rainfall. They spring like mushrooms from the smoking soil. There is nothing on their tongues or behind their eyes, and those who fear nothing should still fear them. When the soul of a murderer or a great sinner rots under the ground, it makes a hollow cyst, which draws rock and wood and moss to it. It gathers up the peat into flesh, braids reeds into bone, and takes rags for skin. It should not walk. But when the night comes, it walks. Should you who read this see one with a sword to your hand, lance it and let it out, or put it to the torch, for it fears the flame. Yeah, that's really cozy. I'm gonna sleep so good. The origins of the Grey Dwarfs may actually have had a much cozier beginning. Our favourite little forest dwellers were perhaps partly inspired by a Swedish children's book, Ronja the Robber's Daughter. So it's possible this bedtime story may yet have a happily ever after. Why not settle in, grab a nice warm mug of mead, and let's enjoy a Valheim bedtime story. Long, long ago, in a realm far away, there lived a woman called... Kelda. Kelda was the daughter of a great and terrible chief, a large and dreadful man with arms like cudgels and a heart full of greed, a raider chief known as Fred. Really? Who is choosing these character names? Seriously. Fred spent his days despoiling the land, leading his men to pillage and burn the quiet homes and villages of the good folk, taking all they could and leaving nothing but ash and sorrow behind them. But on the night that Kelda came of age, ruin instead visited Fred. A great thunderbolt tore through the sky as if cast in rage from the great fist of Thor himself, and it cut the Raider's bridge in twain. A great ravine, wider than a man is tall and approximately 8 meters deep until you hit bedrock, cut through the center of the Raider's land. And without the bridge, they had no choice but to abandon the buildings on the other side. To Fred's great anger, however, the buildings didn't stay abandoned for long. For Fred had a rival, a cunning and despicable man who led his own group of raiders, Ander. Ever looking for ways to taunt and exploit his enemy, Ander and his raiders seized the other half of Fred's domain and took up residence there, leaving no opportunity untouched to mock Fred for his misfortune. A stalemate ensued, for both were equally matched in viciousness and neither could gain the upper hand over the other. But Kelda was a wild and lonely soul, and she did not care for the petty squabbles of men who didn't use the hot tub and never removed their tree stumps. She wanted adventure, conversation, fun. And so it was that one day, when Kelda spotted a man acting strangely on the edge of the ravine, her curiosity got the better of her, and, despite being forbidden to go any closer than 10 paces to the edge of the ravine, she crept closer to watch him. The man at the edge of the ravine was Ander's only son, just as Kelda was Fred's only daughter. And just like Kelda, he carried a very different heart to that of his father. A carefree and curious heart. His name was Bister Anderson. Why am I doing this? Why? Bista was tall, with a quick smile and eyes that twinkled like laughing stars. He dressed in hues Kelda had never seen before, and talked with a lilt that hummed like poetry against the flat and roughened tones used by her father's men. And most importantly of all, Bista was not like her father's men. Bista was different, and Bista was making a game of leaping the ravine. And so Kelda made a game of leaping the ravine too. Bista would leap wildly, all flailing limbs and raucous laughter. Kelda would leap neatly, fleet and neat of foot, coiled like an arrow from a bow. Bista would dash, jumping with his hands to his head, honking like the wild deer. Honk, honk. And Kelda would throw her arms wild and howl like the white wolves of the mountains, jumping to land on silent, padding feet. Back and forth they went, their movements growing wilder and wilder with each great bound across the gap. He a neck, she a wraith, he a locks, she a hare, he a boar, she a seeker. Day after day their joy ran across the tumbled stones like bells. Until suddenly, without warning, it stopped short. A slip, a misstep, a single mistimed foolish stride to hear the pretty girl on the other side of the ravine laugh, and Bista's life was gripping the crumbling edge of the ravine by his fingertips. Without thought, Kelda seized the nearest strong branch and lowered it into the ravine. "Take hold," she called down to him. "I can't," he called back. "You aren't strong enough to hold my weight." But Kelda was a raider's daughter, her shoulders broad and her muscles strengthened by the draw of a hunter's bow. She took the branch down over her knee, and with a great crack, she split the wood in two. She reached for another branch and lowered it down to him once more. "Take hold," she called to him again. "I can't," he called back once more. "You aren't strong enough to hold my weight." But Kelda was a raider's daughter, her hands hard and her arms strengthened by the ringing of axe on firewood. She bent the branch neatly between her arms, and with a great crack, she split the wood in two. She took up another branch and lowered it down to him once more. "Take hold," she called to him again. "I cut Odin's beard. How many branches do you have up there?" he asked. "Not enough for me to prove my strength to you by snapping this one between my thighs," she replied. He paused for a moment, probably from sheer disappointment, and then with a shaking hand, he reached for the branch. Kelda dug her heels into the soft earth and held firm, the branch sure and level in her grip as Bista climbed hand over hand to safety. They sat without words. They had never been on the same side of the ravine before, and things would never be the same again. The moons passed swiftly after that. Spring gave way to summer, summer to fall, and fall to winter. Conversation rose, words stretching out across the ravine between them, the language transformed from movement to that of stories. Stories both idle and grand, mythical and mundane. And slowly, they learned one another. But with winter came problems. Tensions between the two clans had been rising. A poisoned well here, an assassination there, and the currency of hatred had increased in value. And one day Kelda's father returned from the day's raiding with a different sort of prisoner. And this one was not for sale. "Give him to me, father," tried Kelda on the first day of Bista's imprisonment. "He can chop the wood for the fires, and then it will be easy to find me a husband, as my hands will be as soft as silk thread." "You are a chief's daughter, Kelda. It will be easy to find you a husband anyway," dismissed her father. Give him to me, father, tried Kelda again on the second day of Bista's imprisonment. He can care for my horses, and then it'll be easier to find me a husband, as my clothes will smell sweet and will save a fortune on lint rollers. You are a chief's daughter, Kelda. It will be easy to find you a husband anyway, dismissed her father. Give him to me, father, tried Kelda one more time on the third day of Bista's imprisonment. I can skin him alive atop the walls, and then it will be easier to find me a husband, as they will all know how ruthless I am. You're a chief's daughter, Kelda. It will be easy to find you a husband anyway, dismissed her father. Besides, he added, men tend to be put off by that kind of thing. Are you feeling okay? Try as she might, Kelda could not convince her father to part with his prized prisoner, a man he was determined to make an example of, a man he was promising to execute on the morning of the fourth day. Out of time and out of even vaguely plausible reasons to get Bista out of his prison cell, Kelda did what she had to do. Gathering her courage, she once more leaped the gap across the ravine. But this time, when she landed, she was not a wraith, or a hare, or a seeker. She was a ball, she was a neck, she was a lox. She was loud, and she was caught. It is said that when her father received the ransom note that offered an exchange of the respective imprisoned heirs, he immediately stormed down to the cellar and ordered the mead fermenter opened, to see if it was large enough to drown her in. But despite his anger, the next day the exchange itself went smoothly. But Kelda and her father had barely made it away from the rendezvous spot in the meadow before he demanded the truth from her. And when she gave it to him, the mead fermenter was much forgotten. The veins in his forehead bulged and spread like a darkening tide into the whites of his eyes, colouring them the same bloodshot shade as his jowls. If his grinding teeth could have spoken, they would have screamed, but they didn't need to. For the roar of his voice that followed the ring of his hand striking her cheek screamed across the frozen ground as surely as any frost. By sea and by sky, no daughter have I, by the branches above and the roots below, by the glimmer of iron and tin. I call upon the weaving, I call upon the hew, I renounce you as kin. The sacred words of exile had been spoken, and the doors to the keep and the safety of her father's protection had been closed to Kelda. It took Bista 3 days to follow her tracks through the rolling hills and valleys outside the castle, through copses of beech, through gatherings of standing stones, through the thorny clusters of berry bushes, through and out into the black forest beyond. He had never been a very good tracker, and no map runs really do take a different skill set, but he did find her. Nestled in a cave shot through with veins of precious copper, she huddled against the glow of her campfire, her knife glimmering as she whittled. "Kelda, I have come for you," he announced from the cave's mouth. She turned to him and raised a single brow. "You have come for me? I was waiting for you. It's been 3 days. What took you so long?" "I feared you would be hungry, so far from your father's hall, so I stopped to gather food," he explained. And from his pockets he drew handfuls of ripe red berries, the round heads of scarlet mushrooms, and, most precious of all, a single delicious honeycomb. Kelda stared at the food cupped in his hands and eyed the dripping stains in his pockets, before gesturing wordlessly to the fire. A tin pot hung over the crackling flames, bubbling merrily, filled to the brim with a hearty stew. I battled the deer god, took his head, whittled a pickaxe from his fallen antlers, dug deep into the stone for ore, looted the dead in their burial chambers, and turned the soil for wild carrots in 3 days, and you bring me pocket jam? Bista smiled, abandoning the questionable mess of squashed berries to the trees outside the cave. I missed you too. Thank you for coming for me, Bista, she replied. I do have something else, he said, reaching inside his jerkin and pulling out a cupped hand from the pocket hidden within. A faint buzzing sound filled the walls of the cave, and Kelda looked at him with puzzled eyes. I thought maybe we could keep bees and make mead to keep us warm on the cold nights, he explained, his hand outstretched and grasping a clearly upset queen bee. How in Odin's name did you keep a live bee in your pocket for 3 days? She asked him incredulously, before adding, you know, never mind, I don't want to know. The rest of their day took on the rhythm of survival, as Kelda and Bista worked together as only good friends can, fetching firewood, building up their shelter, and placing the somewhat squished and angry bee into her new home. With the bees happy and their own stomachs full of deer stew, Kelda and Bista settled down in their respective beds for their first night together in exile in the heart of the Black Forest. They were deep asleep when the rain began. At first it fell softly, dripping through the pine trees in a gentle patter of cool, round drops, lulling them both deeper into the black well of sleep. But as the loam around them softened and drank of the falling water, things began to change. The rotting berries, so carelessly discarded by Bista outside of their camp, shifted and twisted as a tendril of fungus rose from beneath the ground. But this was no ordinary mushroom. It paused for a moment, as if registering the cool night air on its skin, and then another tendril rose beside it, and another, rising slowly up through the pine-sweet earth until the hands of the monster revealed themselves. With a sickening creak, the hands bent to press upon the soil and heaved the bulbous body of the creature out into the night. The stench of sticky sweet decay filled the air as the monster's blue glowing eyes opened to regard the gloom, and it shook the last of the rain-damp soil from its misshapen, hunchbacked body. It stumbled forward, trying out its newly formed, spindly legs as the rain began to pour, as if nature herself was trying to wash the earth clean of such a thing. But even nature's fury was no match for its uncanny hearing. Inside the cave, a log, as if sensing the horror lurking outside, shifted uneasily upon the campfire, the gentle crackle almost inaudible to the sleeping forms beside it. But outside, the monster's gormless head swung towards the noise all the same. Thoughtless, it drew towards the sound as if the rotting and contorted flesh that formed it still held some memory of a former life that knew the blessings of a hearth fire. And, as it took its first faltering steps, another hand reached from the dirt beside it, then another, and another, and another, until the sanctuary of Bista and Kelda's cave was ringed like a mushroom grove. Only these mushrooms were moving. It was Bista, ever teased for being a sensitive soul, that the rotting stench awoke first. Swiftly, he woke Kelda, and after briefly reassuring her that he had in fact not created the foul smell himself, she came alert quickly, though not quickly enough to grasp her bow. Sensing movement, the creatures poured into the cave, their gnarled claws on their overly long fingers reaching to rend and tear at the flesh in front of them. "Grey dwarfs!" Bista shouted, diving to grab his weapon propped up against the end of his bed. Kelda rolled out of the mass of snarling, biting horrors before her and began a litany of expletives far too vile to be recounted in a bedtime story. Bister, meanwhile, brought his weapon down hard on the head of the grey dwarf before him, causing it to flail into the others behind it, before he took the opportunity and finished it with a swift blow to the throat. It exploded, chunks of wood and resin flying outwards in a hail of shards and spearing into the other grey dwarfs behind it. Now on the other side of the cave, Kelda ducked to hide her face from the airborne splinters and grimly continued shoving a path forwards towards her bow. Her progress through the packed and unpleasantly squishy space was cut short as the grey dwarf she had just pushed past tumbled backwards into the still-burning campfire. Instantly, it was aflame, squealing and windmilling its arms like a grotesque parody of a child losing their balance, and the grey dwarfs around it screamed with it, their voices screeching in a cascade of panic as they ran from the flames before them, tumbling over each other in their haste to leave the cave. The burning grey dwarf collapsed with a crack as wood and resin oozed forth from its smoking remains. Silently, Kelda and Bister looked at one another, and without a single word spent between them, began coating their weapons in the rotten gunk of resin on the floor. Stopping only to lay their coated weapons in the campfire's cheery glow, they strode forth into the night, with braziers of flame licking the tips of their weapons. There, in the moonlit darkness, with the last solitary drips of rain scattering from the pine branches above, they pursued the fleeing monsters, setting them ablaze one by one to return them to the rot from whence they came. As dawn rose, their mission was complete, their trail through the forest marked only by scraps of rags and shards of wood. On their way back inside, Kelda paused at the mouth of the cave, splinters of wood still clinging to her hair, and eyed the mess of spilled stew and grey dwarf parts still inside. "We need a door," she remarked. "You reckon that stew is still good to eat?" "I'm starving," asked Bister wearily from behind her. Kelda dutifully inspected the food at the bottom of the overturned pot, and a grey dwarf's disembodied eye peered back at her. No, I do not." I still have some food," said Bister, helpfully digging around once more in his many pockets. "Somehow I don't think I want to eat mushrooms ever again," replied Kelda warily, sitting down on the edge of her now unpleasantly sticky bed. And so it was that Bister and Kelda greeted their first morning together in the Black Forest, sat knee to knee, passing a mercifully untouched honeycomb between them, and desperately trying to ignore the stinking piles of grey dwarf remains all around them. Kelda and Bister would have many more adventures in the forest in the days and weeks to come, but those are stories for another time, in another hall, in Valheim, a place where the grey dwarfs call home. Sleep well, fellow Vikings.